purpose. It's going to be for the glory of God. Notice what happens next. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. We must do the work. He includes us in it. People say, hey, why doesn't God do something? People are starving. You know what God does? With a smile, he looks down, he says, why don't you do something? There are about 40 men in the world who own 60% of the world's wealth. And that half of the world, which is the poorest half, owns 1% of the world's wealth. In Russia, 1 in every 3 people earns less than $1 a day, and many of them, if not most, are engaged in illegal activities to survive. The Russian mafia is probably the biggest mafia on earth. So Jesus says, we must. He includes us very graciously, because whatever you and I can do to alleviate pain or sorrow, that we are to do in union with Christ. In the last great day, God will want to know about how we've lived, whether we've lived selfishly or whether we've seen life as an opportunity to work with him. That's what life's about, an opportunity to work with God, to lessen pain, to lessen loss. As long as it's a day, we must do the work of him that sent me. Notice, Jesus doesn't apparently consider that life is a very long affair. As long as it's a day. That's life, a day. And remember, once you pass 20, you pass midday. Because the first 20 years, your life is the longest half. So once you pass 20, you pass midday. And some of us are very near to midnight. The day, we must do the work of him that sent me. Night's coming when no one can work. Opportunity, you remember, symbolised by the Greeks as a racing man with a forelock of hair. And unless you grabbed it, he's gone. That's opportunity. Knocks once, then it's gone. Grab every opportunity to do good. Because the night is coming, death. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with saliva and put on the man's eyes, as though he's underlining the problem. Who could think that putting mud on a man's eyes could precede him seeing? No one would think that. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. That word means sent. The pool was a symbol of Christ, who's the well of water. Roy and I were talking about that a moment ago. Christ is the source of all the refreshing things of the world. And the pool named Sent was a symbol of the coming Messiah, who would be sent from heaven. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. It's very interesting, and at least 3 times in this chapter, the Greek word used for seeing literally means seeing again. But he wasn't seeing again. What are we to learn from this? Calvin said that God is like a tall man who bends down to lisp to a child when he writes in Scripture. The Bible is written in the language of men. It's not a scientific textbook. It's perfect and infallible for all it's intended to teach. But it's not an inquire within upon everything. About 75 times the Bible talks about sunrise and sun setting, but it doesn't do either. But that's the language of human relationships. We use it. It's in the newspaper, sunrise, sunset. So the Bible uses language that's right down where we are. It's not always using technical expressions. This is so very, very important. When you read about Genesis 1 and God setting the sun and the moon and the stars in the firmament of heaven on the fourth day, when you read that on the sixth day heavens and earth were finished and all the hosts of them, all the stars. But when you read the book of Job, the morning stars sang together before earth was created. So read the Bible for what it was given for. And remember, the Torah speaks in the language of men, a Jewish proverb. Perfectly reliable for its purpose, but don't abuse it. When you read about falling stars, stars don't fall, but meteors do. Stars don't fall. Meteors fall. But it looks to us like stars are falling. So the Bible uses our ordinary language. It comes down into the kitchen. It comes down into the workplace. It's on the farmer's lot. So everyone can understand it. Don't twist it and turn it. So he came seeing. But the Greek word says seeing again. His neighbours and those who'd formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man?" You know, your eyes have a lot to do with the impression of your face. And so they weren't 100% sure. How does a blind beggar walk? He probably walks a bit like this. You know, you're feeling your way. But this man's not walking like that. And I say, is that the same man? He says, yes, I'm he. He insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes open, they demanded. He replied, the man they called Jesus. Later on, he's got a different name for Jesus. Later on, he calls Jesus a prophet. And at the end of the chapter, he worships Jesus as the Son of God. They're the steps you and I go through. We go to Sunday school or Sabbath school and we hear about a man called Jesus. We don't understand theology, Christology, anthropology and all that stuff. He's a nice man called Jesus. Later on we learn he could work wonders and he spoke great things. You know, the word prophet in the Bible does not always mean someone who foresees the future. It means a teacher, a preacher, someone who gives warnings. John the Baptist was the greatest of the prophets. How many predictions did he make? Precious little. So prophet in the Bible means a spokesman for God. So this man knows Jesus as a man. That's how we meet Jesus. Then he learns of him as a prophet, a spokesman for God. Finally, he sees him as the Son of God. That's the way we go too. The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. Why didn't he say that Jesus spat on the ground? Because he didn't see it. He was blind at that point of time. But he did feel the mud. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. Notice the miracle was dependent on obedience. You and I are not saved by works, but nobody's saved without them. You say, well, the thief on the cross didn't have any works. Oh, yes, he had a very active tongue. He rebuked his fellow thief. We indeed justly suffer. He acknowledged the sinlessness of Jesus. This man has done nothing amiss. He called Jesus Lord. He exercised great faith. Oh yes, he had works right enough, but he wasn't saved by them. You and I are never saved by works because they're too poor, fall short too much, too late. but we're not saved without them. The evidence of justification is sanctification. Without holiness, no one sees the Lord. Where's this man? I don't know, he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who'd been blind. The day in which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore, notice the Pharisees are very upset. Fancy spitting on the ground, making mud, telling a man to go to the pool of on the Sabbath day. You know, the best things in bad religion become a burden. Sabbath is called a delight in the Bible. It's called a luxury. For people who worked very hard 6 days a week, it was a luxury. And it was meant to be for us. But the Pharisees twisted it. So they asked him how he'd received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, I washed, now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man's not from God, he doesn't keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a sinner do such miraculous signs? So they were divided. Several times in John's Gospel, it talks about a division over Jesus. And a large section of John's Gospel is Christ in debate with the Pharisees. Now, some very gentle Christians cannot tolerate religious debate. And for many Christians, the greatest virtue for Christians is unity. Well, it is a great virtue, but it's not the greatest. Truth sometimes brings disunity and schism. Christ was the truth, and because of him, over and over and over again, we read of a schism. I came not to bring peace, but a sword, because the truth resisted brings persecution. Finally, they turned to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he's a prophet. The Jews didn't believe that he'd been blind and received his sight, so they sent for the parents. The parents are very careful because they know that the Jewish leaders, and in the early chapters of John, where it mentions the Jews, it's always referring to the leaders, not the people. The parents know that the leaders have decided that anyone who confesses Christ will be excommunicated. So they say in verse 20, we know he's our son. We know he was born blind. How he can see now? Who opened his eyes? We don't know. Ask him. He's of age. That meant he's at least 30. A Jewish man came of age at 30. That's when a man became a priest, if he's going to be a priest. That's when Jesus became a priest, anointed at 30 years of age. Baptism in Jordan. So, ask him. He can speak for himself. Parents are afraid. Verse 24, a second time they summoned the man. You know, sin makes fools of us all. I've confessed to you before. I often ask God to forgive my sins, but even more often I ask him to forgive my stupidity. Sin makes fools of us. And this is quite a humorous chapter because we find the Pharisees going round and round in circles, doing stupid things. And they get so irritated because they can't have their way and they can't convince the blind man that he's really still blind. They can't convince him that Jesus is a villain. So they start to curse and to swear. A Chinese man was once watching an argument. And other people present knew the Chinese man didn't understand a word. And when the argument was over, the Chinaman pointed to one of the combatants and said, he lost. How do you know he lost? Anyone who gets angry must have lost. That's how you know. So in this story, these foolish Pharisees